Welcome to the lecture on namespaces. So if you open up the material folder, you can find namespaces. Open this up, go to example 1, define namespace. So we'll define a namespace and then we'll use them. If you open up this folder, you will find two files. Open that up. The logical flow is to understand how to declare a namespace and how to use it. So we'll declare a namespace and we'll use a namespace. For this, we'll create this file, define namespaces.php. Okay, so for this we will create a folder in www as a namespace. So let's go ahead and create that folder. Okay, and we'll place all our files here. So we'll copy this file name. So Control N, Control S, we'll go to namespace folder and we'll save the file here. Okay, so let's define a namespace here. So before that, let's understand some definitions about namespaces. The namespaces are case insensitive. So remember that you can use namespaces in any case that you want, and it doesn't really matter because it is case insensitive. Namespaces are used to avoid name collision between other libraries. As discussed, compare namespace are like folders, right? Let's say you have this www folder and then you created a namespace folder. Now your files has been organized based on the namespace folder. Similarly, if you have a code where you want to organize it based on name, right? Namespace have similar concept like folders, wherein you can create a file in the same directory, but you can give a namespace to it, a name to it, so that you can easily differentiate all the libraries and inside that namespace with that name. Okay, now if you want to access a file in a folder, you know you have to access within the folder and then the file, right? Similarly, if a namespace has been defined, you have to access namespace name first and slash the actual constant, right? Namespace is a keyword used to define namespaces. So you will attach a namespace, a keyword to define a namespace. And there are a couple of things you can only define in a namespace. You cannot do variables in namespaces. You can only define classes, interfaces, functions, and constants. These are the only thing that you should define in a namespace. You should not define a variable and try to use that variable. It won't work. Okay. So organizing your classes, interface, function, and constants can be done with namespaces. And namespace, when you declare it, it should always be in the first line. If you declare in the third or fourth line, then it will error out. Okay, so make sure you declare namespace as a first line. There is a keyword called include, which is used to include any file into another file. Okay, this we'll look into as an example. Then you'll understand how to use include keyword. Then you'll use the backslash to refer the subdirectories. Like you have this backslashes. Similarly, you will have backslashes for namespaces to use. So you will understand this concept when we work around an example. But remember the key features like namespace are key sensitive. You can only define classes, interface, function, and constants. You have to define namespace in the first line. Okay, so let's try writing one namespace and then we will try to include them in the namespace here. So for that, we will create one namespace file first. And I'll call it as namespace constants.php. Okay, imagine this file is your library file, right? And you want to include this file into another file and then use all the constants that is defined in this file. Okay, so I created one more file. So let's define the namespace first. So we say namespace is a keyword to define namespace, right? So I'll say namespace and then I'll say my constants. Okay, then we say constants are allowed in the namespace, right? Then we'll define a constant and we'll say file underscore name. We'll give this names space constants.php and we'll also add an end of line to this. Okay, so it's pretty simple. We have defined a constant here. we have defined a constant in this namespace file, and we have named this namespace with a keyword called namespace. Okay, it's similar to how you name a folder. So for this ww, we have created a folder called namespace. Similarly, if this file has to differentiate with other namespaces, you give a namespace name to it. And if you want to access the constant in that namespace, how you access a file inside a folder, you use the folder notation and then you access the file name. Similarly, if you want to access a constant, you use the namespace name first, then you will access the constant. Okay, I'll show you how I'm going to use that. So let's go to define namespace. Now we'll try to include that namespace, and then we will try to use that, print that constant. Okay, so to include, you can say include. Okay, we're going to include that namespace here. Namespace constants.php. We have included that namespace here. Now once you include this namespace, you have access to this file name constant now. Okay, and how do you access that? Okay, so we'll say here include the namespace file, and how to access the namespace. So you can say my constants backslash file underscore name. Okay, let's run this. So if I'm in the ww folder, go to namespace folder, then you can run the define namespace. So if you see the namespace name, it's my constant, and you see the cap notations, and here the cap notation, it's all small and it's not all small here. So the reason behind is namespaces are case insensitive. You can use any name that you want. Okay, but the constant's name has to be same because the constant is identified with caps. So you put the file name here, and the value of that file name is a file name that we have attached here. That's why the file name has been printed. Okay, so it's a very simple concept. I'll do a just quick recap. When you create a namespace file, make sure you use the namespace keyword. Okay, you give a name to it. The name is similar to as you give a name to a folder. Okay, now whatever you can define inside this, you can access it via this name. Similarly, whatever you define inside a folder, you access it via a folder name, then you access the file name, right? And you can only define couple of things. You can define class, interface, functions, and constants, and anything else that you define in namespace will not be accessible. Okay, and remember the namespace has to be the first line. Let's do a try here. Okay, it will give a fatal error because namespace has to be the first line that you define in your namespace file. Okay, and how to include, you use the include keyword and give the file name, and once you include the file name, then the constants are available and you can access that constant with the namespace name. Okay, similarly how you use the folder name. Okay, I believe it's a very simple and easy concept to remember, and it's a really an important topic that you should include in your programming style as well. Okay, so that's all in lecture on namespaces, and I'll see you in the next one.